The Prosecuting Authority says it respects the court ruling to scrap the murder and attempted murder convictions of hip-hop singer Molemo, Jub Jub, Maarohanye and Themba Tshabalala. The pair was initially handed 20 years jail for murder, and their sentences have been reduced to 10 years by the South Gauteng High Court. The court also suspended 2 years for each on condition they are not convicted of similar offences in the next 5 years. The NPA has not ruled out an appeal. Gauteng NPA spokesperson Phindi Louw said they will study the judgment and see if there are any grounds to appeal. To discuss this issue further, we're now joined in the studio by SABC reporter Aldrin Sampea, who was covering the story for us at the South Gauteng High Court earlier today. Good evening, Alvin, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Now, give us a breakdown of what transpired in court today.
Well, today's proceedings were pretty short. It was just the judgment being delivered. We didn't even have the full bench of judges. Remember that about 3 judges were listening to this case and adjudicating this case. So only one judge came out, Judge Molemo, who came out and gave the judgment, a summarized version of the entire judgment. And basically, as you pointed out earlier on, the convictions of Jub Jub of murder, 4 counts of murder, have been overturned to culpable homicide, as well as the attempted murder charges. Those have been scrapped now. The charge around driving under the influence of drugs and alcohol, those have been upheld. However, what Jub Jub and Themba Tshabalala have done here is the case that they brought is that it's based on dolus eventualis. They basically arguing that the state has not proven dolus eventualis, that they should have foreseen that if they drive under the influence of drugs or whatever, driving recklessly, that they could cause this accident. And the judge basically said that that judgment by Brian Nemavida, the magistrate, the trial judge who listened to this case, he erred actually in his judgment.
Now, how did the court reach today's verdict?
Well, the court reached today's verdict based on that application of dolus eventualis, that Jub Jub and Themba Tshabalala couldn't have foreseen that they could cause that accident, because now, all of a sudden, during this application, for the first time, the 2 appellants actually admit that they were intoxicated at the time and they did actually use drugs. But remember that when the trial was underway at the Protea Magistrates Court, they denied all those charges being brought against them. And the judges said that based on that, it means that they weren't in their normal state of mind. So which means that at the time while driving down the road, they couldn't have foreseen that driving recklessly could cause an accident and possibly kill these 4 students, as well as permanently brain damage the other 2.
Now, the sentences reduced to 10 years. How did the judges reach that in terms of the number of years?
The initial sentences, remember, were 25 years. That was 20 years for murder, which would run concurrently, as well as the two other charges of attempted murder and that one last charge of driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol, for that matter. Well, what the judges here said is that considering that this is culpable homicide, they got to the finding of culpable homicide, the appropriate sentence here should be 10 years instead of 20 years. But the judge did take into consideration the gravity of this crime that has been committed, and considering that the 2 consciously took these drugs, as well as intoxicated themselves when they drove down the road. And the Judge Molemo actually emphasized on the 2 other surviving students who have been permanently brain damaged, and he said that appropriate sentence would be that they should be jailed.
Now, the NPA has hinted that they might take the verdict for appeal. What was the reaction after the ruling from the NPA?
It was quite evident that the NPA was disappointed, because remember, in the first place, they were opposing this application. They also opposed the previous application which Jub Jub brought, as well as the bail application that they brought. And they were quite disappointed. Well, what we hear now from the NPA side is that the Director of Public Prosecutions will now study this judgment by the judges, go through it and see if there are any merits for an appeal, which means that that appeal can only be heard at the Supreme Court of Appeals, or they can even go straight to the Constitutional Court. But of course, the first stop will be the Supreme Court of Appeal.
Now, Alvin, were the families of the appellants in court, and what was their reaction after this verdict?
Unfortunately, we didn't see the families of the appellants. Jub Jub and Themba Tshabalala's families not in court, as well as the families of the boys or the victims of this accident. But the strange thing about this incident is that while we were shooting outside the courtroom, we had one of the mothers of the victims actually walking past, and she was listening to this report and trying to find out what's happening. And that's when we told her that there's a verdict out of the court. We didn't even know that she's the mother of one of the victims. And she just started crying. She was distraught, and how could this happen? She went there, as she puts it, she says that the families were not even told that this matter will be heard today. But they did indicate that they're very angry and very upset. And I guess what they're looking forward to is a decision by the NPA, hopefully to challenge this application, or to rather challenge this verdict by the 3 judges.
But now, Aldrin, what is the normal what is the normal process in terms of when appellants go into court and they go into appeal? Are families not supposed to be notified?
Families should be told every time there is any sort of development when it comes to such a case, because remember that they are affected families, and in this case it's families of those who've been killed as well as those who've been hurt, and these 2 boys who've been brain damaged. And normally what would happen is that the prosecutors should inform the families about what's happening, and it seems in this case it did not happen.
Now, what sort of process are we looking at? If the NPA appeals, where to from now?
If the NPA appeals, that means it goes to the Supreme Court of Appeals. Because it's a Supreme Court of Appeals hearing, it means that no new witnesses will be called. However, all the documents, or the court record as we put it, will be then read through by all the judges, a full bench at the Supreme Court of Appeal. They will go through all those records and then decide whether they feel that the appropriate sentence and the appropriate convictions were handed down by the South Gauteng High Court.
Aldrin, thank you so much for joining us. And that was our SABC reporter, Aldrin Sampea, who was at the South Gauteng High Court earlier today. Now let's take a look at some of the tweets. The internet was abuzz today following the news of Jub Jub's reduced sentence. Let's take a look at some of those tweets. We have Alex, who says, a reminder that appeals are strange beasts, and a judgment in one court is not the end of the story. Zondo says, our justice system works in a strange way. I just can't imagine what the victims' families are going through right now. And we have Vanessa, who says, I somehow do agree that Jub Jub shouldn't have got life sentence. It wasn't intentional. Now, as for Oscar Pistorius and Diwani, give them life sentences. Micah Da DJ says, when did South African laws change? So now we don't really have murder anymore in this country. And finally, Luazi says, jail is meant to rehabilitate, not destroy lives. He wasn't a criminal. He was drunk and has been punished by serving time. The Western Cape High Court has heard that details on how Annie Diwani